Case File 003. Classification: Historical and Psychological Phenomenon. Subject: Human-like entities in global mythology. Every culture on Earth has stories about the unknown. Stories about things seen in the distance. Shapes moving through forests. Figures standing just outside the reach of firelight. For thousands of years, travelers have returned from the wilderness with strange accounts. Hunters describing tall shapes watching from the trees. Explorers claim they heard footsteps pacing through empty valleys. Villagers whispering about figures glimpsed at the edge of their fields, only to disappear moments later. Most of these stories are dismissed as folklore. Misidentifications. Fear playing tricks on the human mind. But when you begin to look closely at these accounts, something strange appears. Because cultures are separated by oceans, by language, and even by thousands of years, all of which have described eerily similar beings. Creatures that look almost human. Creatures that live beyond civilization. Creatures that walk beside us, but never fully reveal themselves. In tonight's case file, we'll travel across thousands of years of human history, from the ancient cities of Mesopotamia to the forests of medieval Europe, to the strange psychological experiences that continue to shape how humans interpret the unknown. Because when we examine these stories closely, we begin to notice something unsettling. The same ideas appear again and again, across cultures, across continents, across time. So the question becomes unavoidable. Why do so many civilizations describe the same kinds of beings? Are these stories simply the result of imagination? Or do they reveal something deeper about the way the human mind processes fear, isolation, and the unknown? Tonight, we open the file. Imagine this. It is the late medieval period, somewhere in northern Europe. A narrow dirt road cuts through miles of dense forest. The trees grow tall and close together, and their branches are tangled like skeletal fingers overhead. Sunlight barely reaches the ground. And for travelers moving between towns, this road is the only safe passage through the wilderness. Or at least, the only path people know. A lone traveler walks the road. His boots scrape softly against packed dirt and fallen leaves. He carries a small pack over his shoulder and a walking staff in his hand. The nearest village is hours behind him. The next town lies somewhere ahead. But between those 2 points stretches miles of forest, miles of quiet, miles of isolation. At first, the journey feels peaceful. The forest is calm, birds call occasionally from the branches, wind moves softly through the trees. The traveler walks at a steady pace, focused only on reaching the next settlement before nightfall. But as time passes, the forest begins to change. The deeper he walks, the quieter everything becomes. Birdsong disappears. The wind is still. Even the insects seem to fade into silence. The traveler notices this slowly. At first, it feels like nothing. Just a moment of unusual quiet. But then the silence stretches longer and longer and longer until the forest begins to feel empty. He pauses, listening. There's nothing. No birds, no wind, just the faint sound of his own breathing. Then he continues walking. A few minutes later, he hears something. Behind him, a faint sound. The soft crunch of leaves. He stops again, and the sound stops too. Slowly, he turns around. The road behind him stretches empty through the forest. Nothing moves. Nothing stands on the path. Just trees, tall and silent, watching. He stares for a moment longer before shaking his head. Probably an animal. A deer, perhaps. Or a fox moving through the brush. The forest is full of creatures like that. He turns and continues walking. But a few moments later, the sound returns. A single step. Behind him. This time he spins around quickly. Again, nothing. No movement, no animals. Just the same empty road disappearing between the trees. The traveler frowns. Animals usually run when humans approach. They do not follow the path behind them. Still, perhaps something is simply moving through the underbrush beside the road, keeping pace. That explanation makes sense. It must make sense. He walks faster now. Not running, just faster. Boots striking the ground with a little more urgency. And for several minutes, the forest remains quiet again. Until another step. This time, the traveler freezes instantly. The sound was closer. Much closer. Just behind him. Slowly, very slowly, he turns his head. Not his body, just enough to look back down the road. And for a brief moment, he thinks he sees something. A figure standing between the trees. Tall. Still. Partially hidden behind the trunk of an old oak. He blinks. The figure is gone. Only the tree remains. Now his heart begins to pound. Perhaps it was just a shadow. Or a branch shifting in the wind. But the traveler cannot shake the feeling that something had been there, and that something was watching him. He continues walking, but the calm from earlier has disappeared. Every sound now feels louder. Every rustle of leaves catches his attention. The forest seems different, heavier, as if the air itself has thickened. Then it happens again. Footsteps, but not directly behind him this time. To the side. Somewhere in the forest, moving through the trees. The traveler stops again. The movement stops as well. Perfectly, as if whatever is there understands exactly when he pauses. Minutes pass. Nothing happens. The forest remains silent. Finally, the traveler exhales slowly. He turns back toward the road ahead and begins walking again. This time, the footsteps return immediately. Not from behind, not from the side, but from deeper in the forest, moving parallel to the road, keeping pace with him. The traveler quickens his stride. The footsteps quicken too. Not chasing, just matching his speed. He risks another glance into the trees, branches, brush, shadows, and for just a moment, he sees movement. Something large shifting between the trunks. Something tall. Something that moves upright. But before he can focus on it, the shape disappears again. Gone into the forest. Now the traveler is certain of one thing. Whatever is moving beside him is not a deer. It's not a fox. Not any animal he recognizes. Animals do not walk upright. Animals do not match a traveler's pace for miles. The road ahead finally begins to slope downward. And in the distance, faint through the trees, he sees it. Smoke rising from chimneys, the outline of rooftops, the next village. Relief washes over him. Civilization is close. Safety is close. The forest will end soon. But as he continues walking, the footsteps remain. Still pacing beside him. Still moving near the road. Always hidden by the trees. And then, for the first time, the traveler hears something else. Breathing. Low. Heavy. Somewhere in the forest beside him. He stops one last time. The breathing stops too. Slowly, carefully, he turns his head towards the trees. The village is only a few hundred yards away now, just beyond the edge of the forest. And there, between two dark tree trunks, he finally sees it clearly. A figure, tall, broad-shouldered, covered in thick, matted hair, standing perfectly still and watching him. The traveler doesn't move, and neither does the figure. For several long seconds, the two simply stare at one another. Man and something that almost looks like a man, separated merely by a thin line of trees. Then the figure steps backward, once, twice, and disappears silently into the forest. The footsteps are gone. The breathing is gone. And the traveler never sees the creature again. But when he finally reaches the village and tells the story, people nod quietly, because he is not the first traveler to describe something like that, and he will not be the last. Before cities, before roads, before the world was mapped and measured, there was wilderness. Not the quiet forest we imagine today, not protected parks or hiking trails, but rather vast stretches of land where a human being could walk for days without ever encountering another person. Forests that stretched beyond the horizon. Mountains no traveler had crossed. Valleys where no name had ever been spoken. For most of human history, civilization existed only in small islands of safety surrounded by an ocean of unknown territory. And humans understood something very clearly. Beyond the firelight, the world did not belong to them. Night made that truth even clearer. When darkness arrived, vision disappeared. The shapes of the land dissolved into shadow. Sounds traveled farther. A branch snapping in the distance could echo through the trees. The rustle of leaves could come from anywhere. And the human mind, designed to survive in dangerous environments, responded quickly. If something moved in the dark, you assumed it was alive. If it looked human, you assumed it had intention. Because throughout evolutionary history, the most dangerous thing a human could encounter was another human. But what if the figure you saw did not behave like a human? What if the shape between the trees stood too still? What if it moved strangely? What if it disappeared before you could reach it? For early humans, these moments were not curiosities. They were warnings. Because the wilderness was not empty. Animals lived there. Predators lived there. Other tribes lived there. And sometimes something appeared that did not fit any category at all. Travelers returned from distant regions with stories. Hunters described figures moving through forests that looked human but were covered in hair. People spoke of beings that ran beside animals, creatures that watched from hillsides, shapes that vanished when approached. No one could prove these encounters, but they were repeated often enough that they became something larger than rumor. They became expectations. People began to believe that the wilderness itself had inhabitants, not animals, not spirits, something in between. The idea appeared in culture separated by thousands of miles. Across continents, people described creatures that resembled humans but belonged entirely to the wild. Hair-covered figures, tall watchers in the forest, beings that can move through wilderness faster than any traveler. And these stories did not always describe monsters. Sometimes they describe neighbors, strange neighbors, but neighbors nonetheless. The earliest written example of this idea appears in one of the oldest stories humanity ever recorded, a story written in clay tablets more than 4,000 years ago, in fact. A story from ancient Mesopotamia. The story of a being who lived among animals, a being that looked human but belonged to the wilderness. His name was Enkidu. When the story of Enkidu was written, cities were still a relatively new invention. Human beings had only recently begun gathering in large permanent settlements. For thousands of years before that, humanity had lived much closer to the land. Hunting, gathering, moving with the seasons. Civilization was purely an experiment, and not everyone, according to ancient stories, had joined it. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Enkidu is described as a man created by the gods to live in the wild. His body is covered in hair. He runs with the animals. He drinks from the same watering holes as gazelles and deer. Hunters who encounter him are terrified. Not because he is violent, but because he is something unfamiliar. He is human, but he's not a civilized human. And that very difference unsettles them. The story suggests something fascinating about ancient human fears. It wasn't simply monsters they imagined beyond the city walls. It was people who had never become like them. People who remained part of the wilderness itself. Beings that move through forests as naturally as animals, watching civilization from a distance. Living beside humans, just never joining them. And Enkidu would not be the last story like this. As civilizations grew, similar figures began appearing across the world. In Greece, in Rome, and centuries later in medieval Europe. Stories of creatures that looked human but belonged entirely to the wilderness. Creatures that stood just beyond the edge of civilization. Creatures people believed. Creatures people believed walked beside us. To understand where the idea of the wild man comes from, we need to travel back to one of the earliest civilizations humanity ever built, ancient Mesopotamia, the land between two rivers, as we've priorly discussed, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Today, this region falls mostly within modern-day Iraq, but thousands of years ago, it was something very different. It was the birthplace of cities, the birthplace of writing, and the birthplace of some of the oldest myths humanity has ever recorded. Around 2100 BCE, scribes began writing a story onto clay tablets using wedge-shaped symbols called cuneiform. Those tablets would eventually form one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history, a story known today as the Epic of Gilgamesh. At first glance, it seems like a heroic tale, the story of a powerful king searching for meaning and immortality. But hidden within the narrative is something far more interesting. The story of a being who lived outside civilization entirely. A being who belongs to the wilderness. The earliest depictions of Enkidu are fascinating. He is described as being covered in thick hair. His body is powerful and muscular. He doesn't wear clothing. He does not speak the language of cities. Instead, he lives among animals. He eats grass with the herd. To the natural world, Enkidu is simply another creature, but to humans he is something unsettling. Yet he lives in a way they have already left behind. The story describes hunters encountering Enkidu while setting traps. Each time they attempt to capture animals, something interferes. Their traps are destroyed. Their prey escapes. Eventually they realize something. Someone is protecting the animals. And when they finally see him, they are terrified. Not because he attacks them, but because he does not behave like a human being. He behaves like the wilderness itself. Think about that for a moment. 4,000 years ago, the earliest known written stories already described a being who looked human, but lived entirely beyond civilization. A being that moved through forests and plains alongside animals. A being who watched humans from a distance. In other words, the first recorded wild man. What makes the Enkidu story even more fascinating is how it ends. Eventually, the hunters bring news of him back to the city of Uruk. The people do not send soldiers to capture him. They send someone else. A woman. Her name is Shamhat, a temple priestess. Her purpose is not violence, but rather transformation. When Shamhat encounters Enkidu, the story becomes symbolic in a way that ancient myths often are. She seduces him. They spend days together, and after this encounter, something changes. The animals that once accepted him now run away. He attempts to return to them, but they no longer recognize him. He has crossed a boundary. He has become something else. Human. This moment in the story is incredibly important because it represents the moment where wilderness and civilization separate. Enkidu leaves the wild behind. He travels to the city. He learns language, wears clothing, and even immerses himself in culture. Eventually, he becomes the closest companion of King Gilgamesh himself, and the wild man becomes civilized. But the existence of Enkidu in this story suggests something deeper about how ancient people viewed the wilderness. They did not see it as empty land. They saw it as a place with its own inhabitants. Beings that were not animals, but not part of civilization either. Creatures that lived in a world parallel to human society. A world that existed just beyond the edges of cities. And once this idea entered mythology, it began to spread everywhere. Over time, cultures began creating their own versions of the same concept. Human-like figures living in forests, hair-covered beings dwelling in mountains, creatures that resembled people but belonged to nature itself. Sometimes they were peaceful, sometimes they were dangerous, but they were always described in the same unsettling way. Almost human. The Greeks would later describe creatures called Satyrs. The Romans would tell stories about Fauns wandering through rural countryside. Medieval Europeans would carve images of hairy Woodwose into castles and churches. So, across cultures and centuries, the same idea continued to appear. Something human-shaped lived beyond the boundaries of civilization, watching, moving, existing quietly beside humanity. And what makes these stories even more interesting is this. Many of them were not presented as fantasy. They were described as possibilities. Travelers claimed to have seen them. Hunters believed they heard them when moving through forests. People spoke about encounters in the same way someone might describe seeing a rare animal. Unusual, but not impossible, which raises a fascinating question. Were these stories simply myths created by imagination, or were ancient people trying to describe encounters with something real, something they could not fully explain? Because when humans move through unfamiliar environments, especially the vast wilderness, the mind has a tendency to see shapes where shapes should not exist, to see figures where no one stands, to feel watched, even when alone. And sometimes the brain does something even stranger. Sometimes it creates the impression that something is walking beside you, not attacking, not approaching, just moving in the same direction, always just outside your field of vision. A shadow between the trees, a shape disappearing behind rocks, a sound that seems to follow your footsteps. Experiences like these are incredibly common for travelers in isolated landscapes, and throughout history, humans have interpreted them in very different ways. Some believed spirits were watching them. Others believed animals were stalking them. And many believed something far stranger, something human-like, was moving through the wilderness alongside them. Which brings us to the next stage in the evolution of these stories. Because once civilizations began expanding into forests and mountains, encounters with the unknown became far more common. Travelers began describing figures that did not resemble Enkidu at all, creatures that were not simply human beings living in the wild, but something older, something tied to nature itself. Creatures that seemed to belong to the forest. And spirits that ancient cultures believed lived in the deepest parts of the world. Creatures that did not merely walk beside us, but watched humanity from the shadows of the wilderness. By the time the civilizations of ancient Greece began to flourish, humanity had already spent thousands of years telling stories about what lived beyond the edges of society. By this time, cities had grown larger. Trade routes stretched across mountains and seas. Philosophers debated the nature of existence. But despite all of this progress, one thing had not changed. The wilderness still belonged to something else. To the ancient Greeks, forests were not simply collections of trees. They were places filled with presence, places where travelers felt watched, where strange sounds echoed between hillsides, where the line between imagination and reality blurred. And because of that uncertainty, the Greeks believed something lived there. Not exactly monsters, not exactly animals either, but something far more unsettling. One of the most famous examples of these beings was the satyr. Satyrs appear frequently in Greek art and mythology, often depicted with the body of a man and the legs or horns of a goat. At first glance, they might seem like strange fantasy creatures, but their symbolism reveals something deeper. Satyrs represented the untamed side of human nature. Instinct, desire, impulsiveness, everything that civilization tried to control. To the Greeks, civilization required discipline, order, structure, laws, but the wilderness represented the opposite: chaos, freedom, instinct. And satyrs were believed to embody that wild energy. They lived in forests. They wandered through mountains. They followed the god Dionysus, the deity associated with wine, ecstasy, and the breakdown of social boundaries. Where Dionysus traveled, satyrs followed, laughing, dancing, drinking, behaving in ways that civilized society considered dangerous. But satyrs were not always portrayed as simple tricksters. In some stories, travelers who wandered too far into remote forests claimed to hear strange music echoing through the trees, the sound of flutes and laughter, movement in the underbrush, and occasionally figures glimpsed in the distance, half human, half something else, just watching from the shadows before disappearing. While satyrs are now often seen as purely mythological creatures, they may have originated from a much simpler source. Encounters with unfamiliar people could be that source. Ancient Greece was surrounded by rugged terrain, dense forests, mountains, and isolated valleys. Many tribes lived in these remote areas, groups that city dwellers rarely encountered. When travelers glimpsed unfamiliar figures moving through forests or hillsides, their appearance might have seemed a bit strange. Hair-covered bodies, animal skins worn as clothing, movement that blended naturally with the wilderness. To someone unfamiliar with these groups, such encounters could easily become something more mysterious. Over time, the stories grew. Details changed. Human figures became something less human, something symbolic, something that represented the wild itself. And that is how myth often works. Real encounters evolve into storytelling. Storytelling evolves into legend, and legend becomes mythology. The Romans would later inherit many of these ideas from the Greeks, but they gave the creatures a slightly different name. Instead of satyrs, they spoke about beings called fauns. Fauns were woodland spirits believed to inhabit rural landscapes, such as fields, forests, and mountain slopes far from cities. Unlike satyrs, who were often depicted as chaotic followers of Dionysus, fauns were sometimes described as quieter presences. Usually, they were described as watchers of the wilderness, guardians of natural places. Travelers who ventured into isolated countryside sometimes claimed to hear footsteps that did not belong to them. Branches snapping behind them, movement in tall grass. But whenever they turned to look, nothing was there. Roman writers describe these experiences carefully. They did not always claim people saw creatures directly. Instead, they described something more subtle. The feeling of a presence. A sense that someone or something was moving nearby. Following. Watching. Keeping distance. Modern psychology actually has an explanation for experiences like this. When humans travel through unfamiliar environments, the brain becomes hyper-aware of movement. Our ancestors evolved this ability for survival. In wilderness environments, detecting movement quickly could mean the difference between life and death, because predators rarely announce themselves. They watch first. They wait. They follow. As a result, the brain constantly scans the environment for patterns. A moving shadow, a shifting branch, a distant sound. When the brain detects something unusual but cannot identify it clearly, it fills in the missing information, and often it fills it in with something human-like. This instinct is powerful. Even today, hikers traveling through remote forests sometimes report the sensation that someone is nearby. Not attacking, not approaching, just moving somewhere beyond sight. And while these experiences are often explained by animals, shifting light, or psychological perception, the feeling itself can be incredibly convincing. Imagine experiencing that sensation thousands of years ago. No scientific explanation or any knowledge of psychology. Only the certainty that something moved through the forest beside you. Something that seemed aware of your presence. Something that stayed just far enough away that you could never see it clearly. It is not difficult to understand how ancient cultures interpreted those experiences. They believed the wilderness had inhabitants, beings that were part of nature itself, creatures that watched travelers, creatures that could move unseen, creatures that understood the forest better than any human ever could. And these ideas continued evolving as civilization spread into new territories. When people moved deeper into forests and mountains, they brought their stories with them. Stories about wild men, forest spirits, and creatures that looked almost human. By the time the medieval period arrived in Europe, these stories had transformed once again. No longer spirits of wine and wilderness, no longer symbolic creatures representing instinct. Instead, people began describing something much closer to the wild man of ancient Mesopotamia. Hair-covered beings. Towering figures living deep within forests. Creatures that looked unmistakably human, but behaved like animals. These beings became known by a strange name, the Woodwose, and for centuries, people really believed they were real. By the time Europe entered the medieval period, the wilderness still dominated the landscape. Cities existed, but they were small. Stone walls surrounded them like islands of safety. Beyond those walls stretched forests so dense that sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Travel between towns was slow and dangerous. Roads were narrow. Bandits were common. And in many places, the forest itself felt alive. To medieval travelers, forests were not just obstacles. They were places filled with uncertainty. Branches creaked overhead. Animals moved silently through the undergrowth. Fog settled between the trees, often distorting shapes and distance. And in that environment, people sometimes saw things they could not explain. Figures moving deeper in the woods. Shapes standing just beyond the path. Something watching, and then disappearing. Stories about creatures living in these forests spread quickly across Europe. These beings were known by many names, but one of the most common was the Woodwose. The word itself sounds strange today, but it actually comes from the Old English phrase Woodwose, which essentially means man of the woods. And according to medieval descriptions, that is exactly what they look like. The Woodwose was usually depicted as a tall, human-shaped figure covered entirely in thick hair. What makes these creatures particularly interesting is where they appear. They are not just found in folklore, they appear in official medieval art, carved into stone walls of castles and painted into illuminated manuscripts, even used in heraldry, the symbolic imagery placed on family crests. For example, several European noble families used images of wild men holding clubs as part of their heraldic shields. This suggests something fascinating. The Woodwose was not treated as a completely imaginary creature. Instead, it existed somewhere between mythology and possibility. Medieval writers sometimes described the Woodwose as dangerous creatures that could attack travelers. Others described them as shy beings who avoided humans whenever possible. But most depictions share something in common. They lived deep within forests where few people traveled, places where sightings would be extremely rare, places where proof would be nearly impossible to obtain. One medieval chronicler wrote about travelers encountering hairy men of the forest who ran quickly into the trees when approached. Another account described hunters glimpsing large figures moving between hillsides before disappearing into thick brush. Were these exaggerations? Possibly. But it's important to remember that medieval Europe still contained enormous areas of untouched wilderness. Entire regions were barely explored. Some travelers even spent days moving through forests without seeing another human being. And in environments like that, strange encounters are almost inevitable. The human brain does something interesting when placed in isolation. When we are alone in unfamiliar environments, our senses become extremely alert. We listen more carefully. We watch the landscape more closely. Every movement feels significant. Every sound feels meaningful. The heightened awareness is part of our survival instinct, but it can also lead to misinterpretation. Stories repeated across generations slowly become belief, and belief becomes tradition. By the medieval period, stories about wild men were so common that many people accepted them as part of the natural world, just like wolves lived in forests and bears lived in mountains. Hair-covered humans were believed to live in the deepest wilderness. But Europe was not the only place telling these stories. Similar descriptions appeared in Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and even the Americas. Across cultures separated by oceans and centuries, people described remarkably similar creatures. Hair-covered beings, large human-shaped figures living far from civilization, creatures that avoided human contact but occasionally revealed themselves to travelers. Why would so many cultures describe similar beings? There are several possibilities to this. Some historians believe these stories came from encounters with unfamiliar tribes or isolated communities. Others suggest that early humans may have encountered distant relatives of our own species that lived alongside humans thousands of years ago. Creatures like Neanderthals or Denisovans once shared part of the world with Homo sapiens. And while those species disappeared long before the medieval period, memories of encounters may have survived in ancient storytelling. There's another explanation as well, a simpler one. Human beings are very good at seeing themselves in the unknown. Our brains are wired to recognize human shapes faster than anything else. Even vague silhouettes can trigger the impression of a person. A tree trunk in dim light, a rock formation on a hillside, a shadow moving between branches. For a brief moment, the brain may interpret these shapes as human figures. And once that idea appears, it can be very difficult to shake. But regardless of the explanation, the belief remained. Something lived in the wilderness. Something that resembled humans but did not belong to civilization. Something that watched travelers from the edges of forests. Something that walked through the world beside us. And even today, thousands of years after the story of Enkidu was first written, people still report similar experiences. Hikers in remote forests claim to hear footsteps pacing their own. Campers describe feeling watched in the darkness beyond the firelight. Some even claim to glimpse figures moving between trees before vanishing into the distance. Are these encounters misunderstandings, psychological responses to isolation, or something else entirely? That question has followed humanity for thousands of years, and the answer may lie not only in the wilderness, but within the human mind itself. Because the final piece of this puzzle is not found in forests or ancient myths. It's found in the brain, the way humans process fear, the way we interpret uncertainty, and the strange neurological mechanisms that make us feel as though something is nearby, even when we are completely alone. In modern times, we often dismiss these experiences as imagination, a trick of the mind, a misunderstanding of shadows or animals moving through the brush. And sometimes that explanation is absolutely correct. But what makes these experiences fascinating is not simply that they happen. It is how consistently they happen. Across cultures, across centuries, across landscapes that have never touched one another. Human beings have repeatedly described the same unsettling feeling. The sense that something is present when nothing can be clearly seen. So let's take a look at the most complex survival tool humans possess: the brain. The human brain evolved in dangerous environments, as we have touched on in the last 2 episodes. For most of our species' history, survival depended on recognizing threats quickly. Predators, rival groups, natural dangers hidden in the landscape. Our ancestors who reacted fastest to potential danger were far more likely to survive, which means the human brain gradually developed a very specific skill. It became extremely sensitive to patterns that resemble other living beings, especially other humans. Think about how quickly you can recognize a human face. Even from a distance, even in poor lighting, and when the image is incomplete. Our brains are wired to detect the human form almost instantly. This ability helped early humans identify allies and enemies alike. But that sensitivity comes with a side effect. When the brain receives incomplete information, a vague shape, a brief movement, a shadow between trees, it sometimes fills in the missing details. And very often, it fills them in with something human-shaped. Psychologists call this phenomenon pareidolia. It is the reason people sometimes see faces in clouds, and figures in shadows, or even silhouettes in the darkness that seem to move when we look at them. The brain is not trying to trick us intentionally. It is trying to protect us. When survival is on the line, the brain would rather assume something is there than assume nothing is there at all. But there is another, even stranger mechanism that researchers have discovered, a phenomenon known as the sense of presence. This is a documented psychological experience where people feel as though someone is nearby, even when they are completely alone. Mountaineers climbing in extreme conditions sometimes report it. Explorers traveling across polar ice have described it. Even astronauts have mentioned moments where they feel as though another person was present in confined environments. A silent companion just outside of their vision. Scientists believe the sensation may occur when the brain becomes overstressed or isolated. In unfamiliar environments, the brain increases its monitoring of surroundings. Every sound, every movement, and every change in the environment. So when sensory information becomes limited, such as in the darkness, fog, or wilderness, the brain sometimes creates the impression of another presence to fill that gap. In other words, the mind may generate the feeling of someone nearby as a way of processing uncertainty. But while science can explain the mechanism, it does not always erase the experience. Because when someone feels watched in a dark forest, the fear is very real. And fear is one of the most powerful forces shaping human storytelling. When something frightens us and we cannot explain it, we try to understand it through narrative. We give the unknown a shape, a name, a story. That process is how myths are born. Ancient civilizations did not have the language of neuroscience. They did not speak about sensory processing or survival instincts. Instead, they described what they experienced in the language available to them. Spirits in the wilderness, wild men in the forest, creatures that walk beside travelers, beings that appeared briefly and vanished into the trees. Were these stories misunderstandings of natural phenomena? Possibly. But it is also possible that something else contributed to these legends, something far older. The deep human instinct that we are not entirely alone in the spaces beyond civilization. Even today, people who spend long periods in remote wilderness often describe moments where the environment begins to feel different. As if the forest itself has become aware of their presence. Most of the time, there is a simple explanation. An animal nearby, wind shifting through the branches, the mind responding to unfamiliar surroundings. But every so often, someone describes something harder to explain. A figure glimpsed between trees, footsteps pacing their own. A presence that disappears the moment they turn around. Perhaps these experiences are simply the mind trying to protect itself. Perhaps they are echoes of ancient survival instincts, or perhaps the truth is something we have not fully understood yet. Because the wilderness has always held mysteries, and even in a world mapped by satellites and explored by science, some mysteries remain. Whether these beings exist only in our imagination or whether something real once inspired those stories, it is a question that may never be answered. But one thing is certain, the feeling itself has never disappeared. As long as humans continue exploring the unknown, the question will continue to follow us. Because throughout history, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia to the forests of medieval Europe, to modern hikers walking through remote wilderness, people have continued to ask the same unsettling questions. When we move through the quiet places of the world, are we truly alone? Or is something else still walking beside us? For thousands of years, humanity has looked into the wilderness and felt something difficult to explain. Not always fear, not always danger, but a quiet awareness. The feeling that the world beyond civilization is not entirely empty. In this episode, we explored some of the oldest stories connected to that feeling. We traveled back to ancient Mesopotamia, where the story of Enkidu described a being who lived among animals, a man shaped by the wilderness itself. We stepped into the forest of ancient Greece, where satyrs and woodland spirits represented the untamed instincts humanity tried to control. And we walked through medieval Europe, where travelers spoke about wild men moving through forests, creatures that looked human yet belonged entirely to the natural world. Across cultures and centuries, the same idea appeared again and again. Something human-shaped existed beyond the edge of civilization, living in the same world as us, but never fully joining it. Next time, we're going to step deeper into the world of mythology, into stories that ancient civilizations told about beings that did not merely resemble humans, but walked among them. Creatures tied to gods, creatures tied to darkness, creatures that ancient cultures believed could cross the boundary between the human world and something far older. Some of these beings were feared, some were worshipped, some were believed to visit humans in dreams. So in the next case file, we'll begin exploring those myths, the creatures that ancient civilizations believed shared the world with humanity. Some are beautiful, some are terrifying, and some are so strange that even today, historians struggle to understand where the stories began. Until next time, keep asking questions. Keep exploring the stories hidden in history. And remember, sometimes the most ancient fears are the ones that follow us the longest.